We have been reading Walter Isaacson's biography of Elon Musk, and mostly the childhood. And wow, was it rough?
Yep.
Some of the thoughts that we want to share is how such a rough childhood can output such a successful person. And so, yeah, let's get into it.
Yeah, well, I think one of the most shocking stories, this is what basically the introduction of the book is, that Elon was forced to go to a camp called Veld School, where they were given a small amount of food and water, him and a bunch of other kids, and the counselors were encouraging the kids to fight over them. And it was basically, Elon learned that if you punch somebody in the nose, they won't bother you anymore. So that was his lesson.
That's a preface for what his childhood. He goes to a camp where the point is to punch people in the face.
Yeah.
And it's like, geez.
Yeah. I mean, there was also a lot of bullying. I mean, also to the point of hospitalization, where he was pushed down a flight of stairs and then, beaten up to the point where he needed to go to the hospital. So there was just a lot of violence going on, early on. But then also, along with that, a lot of, emotional struggles, especially with his father, where his father was very domineering, verbally abusive, and basically telling him all the time that he was worthless and would never succeed. And so I think that is something that is very interesting, because a lot of parents
that's kind of like the opposite of what parents see as a good childhood and like a good parenting. Well, in his case, the parenting was not parenting, just like
it was
neglect and abuse. But that's the opposite of what parents think of. Like, oh, you gotta to have a well-rounded and successful person. You don't want to go that route.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it kind of reminds me of the Boy Named Sue, the song, where basically talking about how there was this boy named Sue, and his whole life he's like getting made fun of for his name being Sue. And then
his dad had to go off and do something, and wouldn't be
there.
And wouldn't be there during his childhood, and he named his son Sue. It's like, Sue? Jeez, Sue.
Yeah.
But the reason why is because a name that's Sue, that's bound to bring about some challenges. Right?
Well, then he meets up with his father, and he's like, why did you name me Sue? This has been so horrible. And then his dad was saying, like, look at you. Look at how it's made you so strong and resilient, right? And so I think that there is, something to be said about going through challenges as a young person, obviously recognizing that being named Sue is horrific. I'm just kidding. But, like, being verbally abused and, like, punched in the nose.
It's the same sort of idea.
Yeah, is not a good thing for children to go through, but that challenges as a young person is something that
you need to have
that helps you to become stronger. So, I mean, there's a lot of other stories of Elon, like at the age of 6, he walked 2 hours through a bunch of dangerous neighborhoods.
He apparently wasn't allowed to go to this birthday party.
Yep.
And he was like, I want to go to that birthday party. And so he walked,
like 2 hours by himself.
6 years old.
Yeah, to go and
through these dangerous neighborhoods.
At 6, and he knew where to go for like the whole 2 hours. He was like, navigating by himself. And so there was, him and his brother, along with, I think it was their cousins.
This was when they were teenagers, I think.
Yeah, I think that it was like might have been early teens. They went, or maybe even pre-teens. They went to a concert where they saw a dead body. Somebody was stabbed. This was also, he was growing up in South Africa during apartheid. There was a lot of violence going on, and they just they had blood on their shoes, and they were just continuing. They just went to the concert, and they were, so I think that is definitely like an indication of a lot of the things that were just the environment that you're in, right?
Yeah.
Also just like doing a lot of dangerous experiments with explosives and making rockets. Like this is before teens of like very early childhood, just without adult supervision. His mom was working all the time, and of course his dad oftentimes was just, you didn't really want to be around him, so it was just kind of out on your own, right?
Yeah. And I think when you're in that environment, it kind of forces you to become strong. It forces you to take responsibility and become more independent, and that's why he would have that perseverance to keep going, even though he saw a dead body. Like,
right, yeah.
Whew, I mean, ugh. But if you have those experiences, you learn to persevere and you get really, really tough.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two aspects to it. Of like, one, you become independent because you're like, I can't rely on my parents or other people to save me, right? And then there's also the aspect of just having to think things through for yourself. Because if you're growing up in a loving family, you know, there's no reason to question the norms and the culture around you and the expectations. And, you know, your parents tell you things and you're like, okay, that makes sense. And, you know, it's emotionally challenging to challenge your beliefs, to challenge the beliefs of those around you and risk, you know, that social pressure.
Yeah.
And because of that, I think that there's something to be said about going through the experiences of like my father being his father being like a verbally abusive, and then if you're in that situation, you're not going to be like, oh, I guess like you're going to want to challenge his views, right?
Yeah.
You're not going to want to
you can't just take someone who does that and take their views and it takes a lot of mental gymnastics to be able to take that person and also take their views of reality and trust in those views. It's like you can't really do that.
Yeah, so I think that it kind of breeds a sense of like, I just need to figure out these things for myself, because you don't feel like the adults in your life can give you, you're not going to just by default inherit that value set. You could definitely look out, because it's just that we all need to have some way of understanding the world and some way of understanding ourselves, and oftentimes, you know, we just get that from the environment around us, right? That's just kind of the default way that humans operate. But if you're in a situation where you're kind of forced to challenge that, there's certainly other ways in which you could happen by like some other group of people who like, you know, give you some other sort of value set. But I think that in a lot of cases, if you're growing up in a really, really rough situation, you're just kind of forced to reason for yourself about those things. So I think that is, something that you see in a lot of innovators throughout history, is that they just went through extreme hardship that forced them to question things, because otherwise the reward for questioning things was very minimal.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that is something that is like, we do need more and more innovators and people who are able to think independently. But then you also,
we're not saying that they need to have abusive parents and like a neglectful childhood and I don't know, see dead bodies everywhere. It's like no. But like, how do you get that? How do you get the growth without those kind of experiences?
Well, I think that's the real question and the real challenge, is balancing, you know, the challenges that can help with growth, as well as not putting your child through things that are unnecessarily horrific.
Yeah, and the main concept here is antifragility. And a lot of parents, I would say, have a mindset of, you got to have it perfectly at their level all the time, at the child's level, different challenges like that. And if you don't, you're going to break them or something like that.
Yeah, well, there's this whole concept of like the zone of proximal development, and it's like, well, what if, but in life you're going to come across challenges that are too hard, right? Where you have to ask for help, where you have to think like, I don't think I can handle this, so how should I navigate this situation? And there's certainly things that, like, you know, when it comes to, you know, you're not going to just hand a 5-year-old a calculus book and be like, hey, figure it out. But it's like, but there's still things in which I think that there is a lot of shielding that goes on when it comes to trying to prevent children from running into obstacles that would be too hard. But
what really is too hard? Like, you're kind of viewing the child as like a piece of glass where if you put too much pressure on it, it's gonna break. But really, that's not the right view of that. That's seeing them as fragile.
Yeah, where if you can kind of define what anti-fragile actually means.
If they are faced with a challenge that's too hard, that's not what's gonna happen. Where it's like, you can think of it as like, well, there's this word robust, and it's not the same thing. Robust is like maybe plastic, where it's like it can stand a lot and it's not going to shatter as easily as glass. But then there's the concept of antifragility, and you can keep going with that.
This was coined by Nassim Taleb. He wrote a book called Antifragile, basically talking about coining this term because there really wasn't another term in the English language that successfully encapsulated this concept of systems that grow stronger through stress, through hardship. And so that's, you know, that's different than just simply being robust, as you mentioned, which is just being resistant to hardship or to stress. But an example of an anti-fragile system is like our muscles. You know, when you work out your muscles, then they have like micro tears, and that helps it to become stronger.
Because when it heals over to be stronger.
Yeah. So same with our immune system, and same with, I think, just our
growing in general.
Yeah, capabilities as a whole as humans. It really, if you think about the times in your life where you had the most growth, it always came from challenges.
Struggle.
Yeah, so I think that is something that has in some ways been forgotten because we're thinking
it's been drained from our culture.
Well, I think it's just kind of like, as a parent, as an educator, you don't want to see your child suffer.
Yeah.
Right? Of course, that's very natural. And throughout all of his...
The little child, it's suffering, and it's so sad.
I mean, and throughout history, that was very much the right way to approach it, because you would have to face hardship.
There was no real way to avoid it.
There's no reason as a parent to unnecessarily impose extra hardship.
Yeah.
But now, because we can become so shielded, that's when we have to think intentionally about, okay, how do we want to help this person grow as much as possible?
Because especially in the USA, where in these developed places where it's so easy to shield kids and really everyone from certain struggles that you would face back in the olden days, where like things like, I don't know, possibility of starvation, or
it was just kind of universally that parents would beat their children, you know.
Right.
That was just something.
We're not saying beating your children is good, definitely not, but it's the concept of like, of those struggles. Those were just things that were widely accepted. Like, you're going to face struggles sometimes, deal with it. And there was no need.
There was no even capacity to hide them from those struggles.
Because they would just be out in the real world doing stuff. But now we can shield kids from that. We're sitting in a comfortable house. We never have to worry about a lack of food. We never have to worry about like even basic physical like struggle. Like, that's pretty much not really heard of unless it's something you put yourself through, like going to the gym. but
taking the elevator up to the gym.
Yeah,
so you can work
driving
out
over to the gym, taking the elevator up.
Yeah.
Even that is like kind of it's ridiculous how much we don't have to face struggle.
Yeah.
And because of that, well, it's your kids are going to be fragile if they never experience struggle.
Well, yeah, that's what part of what Nassim Taleb covers in his book is that the worst thing you can do to an anti-fragile system is shield them from stress because that's how it grows. And I think that there's some examples that we can give because I think there's definitely, we want to recognize that obviously abuse, violence, all those things are terrible things. We don't want to expose children to those things.
And we won't in terms of like beating them anyway. Just want to make that clear.
Yeah, and so it's like, okay, then how do you help them to face challenges in a way that isn't necessarily contrived, but in a way that is helping them to operate in the real world? And so there's a lot of ways that we face those things at a young age, where our parents would push us to do uncomfortable things, like as young children. When we were at restaurants, they would say, hey, go get the check, like go ask the waiter for the check. And of course there's that social anxiety of like, I don't know this person, right? And you don't really want to do it, but then they were just like, hey, you just got to do this. And so we would go up and be like, hey, can we get the check? And
they also give us free bread at Panera if the little kid goes up to ask for it. Anyway.
And so, but basically it was
just
like
little things like that.
Yeah, it
really
was an experience where we were nervous about it. We did it, and then we were like, oh, okay, it's not that bad, right?
It's not even bad at all.
Yeah, and then there was a lot of other things that we were pushed to do a lot of experiences for essentially public speaking, public singing as well, where of course that's one of the most like nerve-wracking things you can do in a social situation is really putting yourself out there, especially singing, right? And
public singing.
That's like one of the biggest fears that adults have.
But 2 years old, I was up on that preschool stage with you singing Do Re Mi.
Yeah. And so that was things that we were pushed into, as well as interviewing adults that we had never met before, like especially during the pandemic. I did a whole Innovators series where I was interviewing different adults and working professionals, and I had never met these people before. They came on and I was asking them questions, and I was trying to have a conversation, and those I did not really want to do it, but I wanted to do it, and I knew that it would be valuable for me, and I was certainly getting a lot of support from our parents around like, hey, this is something that you after you do this a few times, you're just going to get really comfortable meeting new people, and that's something that you should want for yourself.
Yeah.
Right. But without going through those experiences, then we see that a lot of young people are struggling with things like social anxiety and anxiety over, relatively smaller challenges than what we had to go through throughout history of like,
very small.
Yeah. Like comparing like, oh, I need to talk to this new person that I've never met versus like I need to take responsibility for my family and like go get a job at 10, because that was just something that kids were forced to do throughout history, is confront those challenges. But if you don't have anything forcing you, then that can be a big challenge. So there was also a lot that I think came from entrepreneurial experiences and in terms of pushing us into those sorts of situations.
Yeah.
Especially because you get a lot of rejection as an entrepreneur, of people leaving, of people saying, oh, I don't like this, especially a lot of adults telling us, hey, I don't think that you guys can do what you're trying to do, and trying to, face up to those things.
Well, entrepreneurial is just trying to create something valuable, which is a whole other struggle, and then take it into the world and try and get money from it. So you've got the whole ordeal in terms of like small but significant struggle that you would face in the real world in like today's everyday scenarios. One thing about entrepreneurship, when I started Positivity, which is a dog walking and sitting business that I do, that was actually right after our house burned down. And I think those two are related because that was quite a traumatic experience. There were a lot of struggle that came with that, especially since we lost our dog. But if you go through that, it doesn't seem like a very big deal to just start a dog sitting business and go up to someone and say, "Hey, how you doing? Here's my card. Contact me if you need dog sitting." Like those kinds of things are very, very small in comparison. And when you go through that struggle, you see, hey, the world didn't end. I am here. I am standing. That's a gift. Let me use it. This is and everything else that could add a lot of value just doesn't seem as hard.
Yeah, I mean, I think you definitely see this. Like, Elon built his first computer game when he was very young. He taught himself to code when he was 12, and that was something that, like, you know, I started building WEquil app when I was 12, and you also were, you know, building games in Flutter when you were 12, and of course leading the school and everything.
So basically, we are Elon Musk.
Well, I think it just is just an example of how young people can be pushed into facing hardships, like just doing coding is hard, and you know, we've done podcasts on both coding and math as something that's very important, as something that does challenge you as a person, and is something that is, you know, when you get something wrong, it's right in front of you, and you have to face up to it.
You got this question wrong. Right. That is objective.
Yeah, and I think that is something that is just another example of challenges that young people can go through that can help just build a sort of resiliency, and also a sense of like independence and responsibility, because both those things are ones in which you can easily decide, like, I'm just going to learn more about coding and become better, and you know, be able to solve these problems. And so I think that is something that you also see this where, you know, Elon Musk, he moved to Canada by himself when he was 17, and he also applied for visas for his whole family, just independently, because he's like, hey, I think that this is the best thing for me and for us, and so I'm just going to go ahead and do it. And I think that is also a great gift of software, is giving young people so much room for taking initiative, because you can now just do so many things.
It's a lot easier to go and take initiative and do the things that you want to do, but it's also,
so once you have a sense of responsibility, there's so much opportunity, but it's I think there's a lot to be said about how challenge can induce responsibility, because that's not just going to come naturally if you're never forced to kind of step up in that way of, if I get this wrong, then somebody else will come in and help me, if I just don't have to really face anything that truly challenged me to a point where I think, like, I don't think I can do this, and then you're forced to do it, you do it, and you're like, okay, I can, you know, that's inherently empowering. But I think that a lot of you know, that has to really become more intentional, which I think is the big challenge, is that so many things that we used to get naturally now needs to become intentional, and of course that's going to be inherently more challenging, but I think that's ever more reason for it to be necessary.